All right. So my name is Martin Bellinger. I'm a software architect and developer at Dell. And I'm going to talk about AAA improvements I've been implementing on SONiC. So this presentation will be just a summary of what I've done. If you want more details, there's a high-level design document available on the SONiC GitHub. And there's also this recording of a presentation I made. So what is AAA? AAA stands for authentication, which basically means verifying a user's password. Authorization, often this is used for RBAC or role-based access control or privilege levels. And accounting. Accounting stands for, this is where you log what a user does in the system. So when they log in, log out, but also you can log every commands they enter on the system. The two main protocols used for AAA are Radius and TACACS, and those are pretty old. They're almost 30 years old, and they were not designed for Linux. So SONiC is a Linux platform, and these protocols are missing a few things to interface well with Linux. And that's what we're going to look at, what's missing. So one thing that all applications running on Linux require is that applications need to have a user ID and a primary group ID. So those are the Unix credentials. You cannot retrieve those from Radius or TACACS, at least not the standard Radius and TACACS. There's been some implementations where people have specified ways to do that, but it actually doesn't work that well. And I'll get into that a little bit later. One thing that you really don't want is invent something new. You have a lot of customers that currently have systems and they use Radius and TACACS, and you don't want to tell them, hey, you're going to need to change your configuration to work with SONiC. So that's the rule number one. Whatever we come up with, you cannot assume that customers will make changes for you. Other things that you want is when you assign credentials to your users, they must be unique. And that's because Linux, in order to track users, it needs to have unique identifiers. I've seen many vendors when they try to solve the problem of assigning Unix credentials to Radius or TACACS users, they will map them all to a single user ID. And that introduces security issues because now to Linux, all these users are one and the same, which means if you have any private files, well, they're not private because everybody that has the same credentials as you will be able to access those files. So the credentials really must be unique. It's also required often that each user have their own home directory. And that's where you would put your own personal configuration. For example, when you log, let's say you use Bash as your shell, you want to be able to have your own personal configuration, and that goes into the home directory. Another thing that is often not done properly, people often assume that users will have a single role, like a sysadmin or security admin, things like that. In fact, the RBAC specs, they say you can assign multiple roles to users. And the reason I mention this is often you will see people map the role as a Linux group, as the primary group of that user. And well, when it's time to assign multiple roles, you can not do that if you try to map it to a single group ID. And of course, another challenge, everything has to work with Linux. So it means work with PAM, so the pluggable authentication modules, and work also with NSS, which is the name service switch. So if we look at the details, so here I'm showing what happens when a user tries to log in. You have Bob here sitting at his terminal. He invokes the SSH command to log into a SONiC Linux box. SONiC is a Debian distribution, so it has the OpenSSH SSH server running. So this here inside the green line is your OpenSSH. This is code that cannot be modified to suit whatever purpose you want. So whatever solution we come up with must follow what OpenSSH and other authentication applications may do. So here you got your SSH daemon that is listening for connection. When a connection happens, it forks a copy of itself, and this is now called the SSHD monitor. This is where the authentication of the user takes place, and if everything goes well, this is where we're going to start a shell, whether it's Bash or some other shell. This is the process in charge of doing that. So when this process starts, the very first thing it checks is whether that user has any credentials, and it uses a standard POSIX API called get PW name to retrieve those credentials. And what it gets in return is the user ID, the primary group ID, the shell to be started, things like that. This API is part of a family of APIs that rely on something called the name service switch. So under these APIs, there's something called, it's a way to look up names. So the username, you want to look it up. What's the credentials? So NSS is a configurable module where you can specify one or more modules to look up a name. And I'll get back to this box in a moment. I just want to show the remainder of the authentication process. So once this is successful, then you would typically do the authentication. And this is where you ask your user, please enter your password. The password is then passed to the PAM module. And PAM is also a configurable library where you specify, do you want to authenticate locally or with Radius, TACACS, or other methods. If this goes well, then there's other PAM modules. I'm going to skip this one. One that is important here is the PAM set credential. This is where you have the opportunity to set additional credentials for a user. Earlier, I mentioned the roles for RBAC. Well, that would be the best place here to set that roles persisted somewhere so that it's available to other applications. So how are we going to solve this problem here? Because Radius and TACACS users are defined remotely on a Radius and TACACS server. So, and that Radius and TACACS server do not contain this information. This information is not available locally. So how do we solve this? So the way we've solved this in SONiC was to introduce something called the host account management, or HAM. So HAM is composed of a daemon, HAMD. The main interface to HAMD is dbus. So that's a secured interface that only specific users can access. So it's not open to everybody to go and play with the users and the system. Another component is SAC, for System Assigned Credential. And this is really the glue here that will solve the problem of assigning unique credentials to those Radius and TACACS users. And we'll see that in a second. Other features that we've added to HAM was sometimes based on your role. So if you're an admin, for example, you may want to have additional privileges on the system, like have sudo privileges. So HAM is configurable where you can say, for this role, I would like the user to be added to the sudo group, for example. And then HAM also has a plugin mechanism where if you need to create additional credentials, so you're developing an application that will require all the users to have certificates or SSH keys or whatever. You could provide a plugin that will be invoked whenever a user is created in the system. Automatically, the credentials will be added for that user. Other features that we've added. So we started with these, but after a while, people were asking, hey, could you add more features? So there was a few requests for container-specific features. In SONiC, many of the applications run in Docker containers. And some applications needed to access the user accounts on the host just to do a lookup with, for example, the get PW name. You just want to look up a user. Well, that information is not available in the container. One way to solve that would be to mount the files that you need, like the etc password file and things like that. You could volume mount them into your container. But we believe that this is kind of a security issue. If you start mounting files that are on your host, they become vulnerable. They could be modified by applications running in the container. So we didn't want to go that route. Instead, we provide a new NSS module that is installed in the container, and that will allow functions like get PW name to access, to retrieve user credentials from the host. And that goes through Hamdi. Hamdi is the daemon running on the host that will serve those requests. And finally, we had other requirements. Dell is developing a REST server. It runs in a container. And we needed to support the ability to manage the user accounts on the host. So this is all secured again. You need to have the proper credentials, but if you're a system admin going over REST, you could send the proper commands to create, modify, or delete user accounts on the host. So this is what HAM provides. Now, if we connect all the dots together, so I'm back with this box here. Where you do the get PW name. As I mentioned, this relies on the name service switch to look up that user. Typically, on Linux distributions, you have a module called compat. It used to be called files, now it's called compat. That module simply looks in the etc password file and retrieves the credentials. If the user cannot be found in this file, then the NSS or the name service switch will switch to another module that has been configured. And that's where we supply now this new module called SAC for System Assigned Credentials. This module will now contact HAMD and say, hey, please add this user to the system. And what it means is assign credentials, a unique user ID that hasn't been assigned yet, a group ID, and HAMD will do that, and it will add it to the etc password file, and it will mark that user as being unconfirmed. What it means is we haven't authenticated that user yet. So right now, all we're doing is allocating using unique identifiers, and that's just to get us going with the rest of the authentication. So once we have those credentials and we do the authentication, and let's assume it's Radius that we're using here. So the Radius module will contact the Radius server, authenticate. If it's successful, the Radius server returns an accept, and it will send the roles associated with that user. We go down a little bit later, and then when it's time to set the credentials, we again contact or use the proper module here, so PAM Radius, and we at this point it will finally confirm that user. It will say yes, the user has been verified, the password was good. So we're telling HAMD, please add this user permanently. So At this point, ham or hamd will go to the etc password, remove that marker that we've put earlier that was marking it as an unconfirmed user. And by the way, the reason we're marking the user as unconfirmed is so that we can remove users that fail authentication. And that's important because if you have attackers that are just randomly trying different usernames, you don't want this file to just grow continuously. So by having this marker in there, hamd is able to do an audit periodically and remove those users that haven't been confirmed. So for users that are confirmed, they will be now marked as a good user. And at the same time, that's when hamd will, for example, with the roles in SONiC, we save that to the Redis database so that it's available to any applications that want to look up the roles of a user. And at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, can say, oh, if this user is an admin user, I'm going to add them to the sudo group. So that's where it's done. And all of this is configurable. So the current state, so that code has been submitted. There's a pull request pending right now in GitHub. But that pull request only adds ham, the ham infrastructure. So we have not yet modified these modules here to talk with ham, and we haven't added this module yet. So we want to do that in 2 phases. The first phase is to add the infrastructure, and once it's in there, then we'll start hooking it up to the rest of SONiC. So this is what I'm mentioning, the etc ns switch configuration file. That's where you would add the SAC module, the SAC module. And there's a few other applications in SONiC that are responsible for the configuration of the whole system. So they will need to be modified also to play with ham. So with regards to AAA, there's a few requirements that will be needed in the future. One is the ability to configure authentication differently if you're logging in through the console versus non-console. So the console is your local, serial port, debugging port that you have on a piece of equipment, and non-console would be your remote users like SSH, people that are logging in remotely. And customers usually want the ability to configure those differently, meaning if you're logging in through SSH, they would want to configure, for example, Radius and Radius only for those users. But if you're coming in at the console, they may want a different configuration. And the reason is, if you lose the ability to contact your Radius server, and the only method of authentication is Radius, then you're stuck. You can no longer log into your equipment. So that's why they like to have a safety net at the console where you can come in and configure maybe Radius as your primary, but then you configure a local login as a secondary. And often that's used, they call that the user of last resort. So when nobody's able to log into your equipment, you always have this user that will be able to log in, that does not rely on Radius or any other means of authentication. It only uses local authentication. Another thing that we need to add is a way to run authentication in containers. What I discussed earlier, the OpenSSH session, that all runs on the host. Containers have no configuration for authentication. And sometimes you may have an application that requires that. I mentioned the REST server earlier, that this one requires to authenticate users, but we don't have a native Linux way to do it right now in containers. So we use a little trick there. What we do is the REST server will SSH into the host. And if the host accepts that SSH, we conclude that the user has a valid password. It's been authenticated. So that's how we do it now. But in the future, we want to provide a real PAM module there that can be installed in containers that will support full authentication. And the idea would be that PAM module would talk again to ham that runs on the host and do the authentication that way. So call to action. So there's the HLD I mentioned earlier. So anybody can go and read that. A lot more details in there on what we've been working on. And we need people to just review the pull request. It's a big chunk of code, so it needs a lot of eyes to look at it and review it. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question related to the host user access from the container, similar question. I'll read the question as is. What are the containers having the features to access host accounts? It's also on the Zoom chat if you want to read it. I think you've covered some of it in your second last slide.
Yeah, let me stop the sharing maybe so that I can access the Zoom. Because right now my whole screen is taken. Okay.
Oh, okay. No problem.
All right. What are the containers having the feature to access? I guess the question is which containers have the feature? So there's a feature that Dell has been working on. It's they call it the management framework. So inside a container, I mentioned the REST server. We also have a CLI, so a CLISH CLI. CLISH is a Cisco style CLI that you can run. So we're running that inside containers, and these applications, they require retrieving the credentials of users. So the user ID, the group ID, things like that. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think so. While we wait for other questions, Martin, did you say the HAMD is in PR right now?
Yeah, there's a pull request for it, yeah.
Okay. Is this also being discussed on the SONiC calls?
Yes, yes. In fact, at the beginning, I mentioned there's a recording when this particular feature was introduced. There's a recording. It's about an hour long, but I went in the details there. So there's a lot more details that I did not cover today. If people are interested, they can watch that YouTube video.
Sounds good. We'll just wait for a few minutes since we have at least 5 minutes more.
Okay.
And as in the next process, the work that is happening, I know you highlighted a little bit of that right now. So beyond after HAMD integration, you expect more containers to be integrated, or the PAMD for containers?
Yeah. So yeah, maybe I can share again. Yeah, so some of the features, this is actually a pretty big feature, supporting different configuration if you're on the console or coming in through SSH. So I'm not sure when that's going to be done. Like I said, it's pretty big. authentication from containers, that's probably something that will come next year for sure. But the first thing is really to get that pull request merged to the main branch, and then starting hooking up the different components into ham. So once that's done, then we can think about the future features.
Okay.
So Martin, Rupa, while we still have a couple minutes here, if folks are interested in participating and getting involved with the work that you're doing, how can they do that?
So SONiC is it's open source. Microsoft is behind it, so you need to follow their guidelines. If you go to that GitHub, and I think I had the address over here, so GitHub Azure SONiC. If you go there, there's all the guidelines how you can contribute. So once my code is in, anybody can go in there, add features, fix bugs. Yeah, it's an open community. Anybody can go and contribute as long as you follow their procedure.
Yes. And I'm guessing one can reach out on the SONiC calls as well.
Yeah, exactly. So every week they have weekly calls. So that's where the community meets and people will present new features or ask questions. Yeah, that's the proper place for that.
Yeah. So just another question, since we have 2 minutes. So HAMD is a SONiC specific daemon, right? It's not an independent plugin for say AAA or TACACS. It's very tangent to SONiC.
Well, actually, that's a very good question, because this was first developed at Dell. So Dell, we develop our own network operating system. We just started maybe a year and a half ago, working also on SONiC. But Dell has developed something called OS 10, and we have ham in there too. So we decided to take that piece because it was very portable. We decided to put it in SONiC. So it's not tightly coupled to SONiC. It's a very portable piece of software, and I tried to keep it that way.
Okay, great. That's good to know. Okay, thank you, Martin.
Thank you.